"You're nothing but a charity case, Daniel. Always have been," Ethan said, loud and deliberate. And the hush in the funeral parlor pressed against my throat the way winter wind presses through the cracked window of the house I kept for my parents. Maya looked up from the program in her small hands, and I felt my ribs contract with the exact same old shame that had lived in me like a splinter since I was a kid on the porch swing. "My name is Daniel Reed. I'm 42 from Akron, Ohio." The room smelled of lily and coffee, the kind from a diner no one opens after midnight, and Harold's old war buddy, Frank Dalton, wiped his eyes with a thumb as if he could rub away what Ethan had just said. My mother, Margaret, would have squeezed my hand then. She'd always done that to make me stop swallowing words. But she was already a clean voice in the hymnal and a faint scent of Clorox in the nurse's room. None of that mattered to Ethan, who stood in a cheap suit 2 sizes too proud and smiled as the last piece of paper was unfolded and read aloud. Everything to Ethan. I watched the way the people in the pews moved their eyes from my face to Maya's and back again, as if they were tallying how much dignity I had left to spend on my own daughter, a dignity I had given away in small, daily payments for the last 15 years. The chipped apple-shaped kitchen timer sat on the table between the coffee pot and a pile of overdue notices like a tiny accusing son. My mother had liked the shape because she said baking needed small, honest things to count on. I had kept it because counting is what I did when I balanced their bills at midnight, punching numbers into a slick, borrowed laptop, while Harold slept with the TV low, and the sound of his breathing was a slow metronome that marked every sacrifice. Ethan reached out and tapped the edge of the urn as if testing what had weight. "You think you earned anything?" he said, and a cousin laughed like a stick breaking. I could feel the people I had looked to for comfort pick up their judgments like spare change. "You washed their socks, Daniel. You mopped their floors. That don't buy you a house." I let Maya tighten her grip on my hand because that small act of protection was the only armor I had left right then, and the only thing I could not afford to break. "You always wanted to be a hero," Ethan added, and because the world grants cruel metaphors to men who burn themselves up for other people's warmth, I heard his voice echo as though in a cheap movie theater. I wanted to tell him that what he called charity was the only honest life I'd been allowed. The only life that put food in a bowl for my parents, kept an old man from freezing in February on a porch that once faced better days. But instead I let the silence answer, and silence is a brutal, patient thing that does not forgive or explain. The attorney, Jasper Collins, cleared his throat and handed Ethan the envelope, like a consecrated object, and the room broke into murmurs that sounded for me like the opening chords of a song meant to celebrate someone else. The Apple timer ticked in my memory. Every click a ledger entry. Calls to social services, nights sleeping on the couch, missed shifts that would have paid for my own little ambitions. The empty chair at my daughter's recitals when I couldn't afford to fly out, the countless times I smiled and wrote off the cost of loyalty. Time is a ledger, I thought suddenly. You spend it and someone else writes the balance. That was the first thing I would say to myself that mattered, soft in the press of everyone else's condemnation. Time is a ledger. What you spend will either pay or ruin you. I stood when it was polite to stand. I said what you say at funerals because there are phrases built for the job. She was everything to us. He would have wanted, and the words slid past me like raindrops on a car. Maya's eyes were small, stormy. She mouthed my name, the one I had promised to hold steady for her, and I felt something unspool that I had wrapped tight for years. I left the parlor without arguing over the will, because the last thing I wanted was to let my daughter see a man I called brother turn the final page on our father's memory and mine. I walked through the bright cold into the parking lot, where trucks hummed and headlights cut the wet asphalt, and the flash of each passing vehicle felt like the jangle of coins in a bowl I had been told for years I didn't deserve. I had by then learned that shame shouted loudest where the people you hope to impress sat watching, and that the worst kind of humiliation is the kind that lands in front of the person you adore. I drove home with the windows down that smelled of old newspapers and diesel and the cheap motor oil of a life that didn't wait for you to become someone before it took what it needed. The house we had kept for my parents stood as if waiting for judgment. I had kept the lawn clipped, the mailbox upright, Harold's tool bench in the garage still arranged by size, the worn baseball glove hanging from a nail. The Apple timer on the kitchen counter ticked as if it had been waiting for me to decide whether to wind it. I wound it once, out of habit, and let the thin mechanical tick steady me like a pulse. I ate diner coffee and a stale donut and made the concrete, private decisions people make when left with nothing but the work of their hands and a name on a will. And I chose the one thing that always seemed somehow righteous and very human. I walked away. I sold nothing that day. I screamed at no one. I did not call Jasper to argue. I left the house with a single double-locked box I had assembled over months of careful saving, old tax vouchers proving years of unpaid labor, a faded photo of my mother holding a pie she had baked for Harold on his 50th birthday, and the Apple timer with its paint worn to the metal where my mother's thumb had rested. I placed the box in the back seat like a hidden witness and drove toward a cheap hotel off the interstate, as if that temporary distance could reframe the shame into something useful. I had no plan, only a small, stubborn decision to stop giving people my sorrow as fuel for gossip. The city lights gave me a shred of privacy, and I slept against the noise of a vending machine, the hum of late radiators. I let the first quotable thought arrive because a man who has been trod upon needs a line to remind himself of who he once believed he was. Pride built me, and poverty taught me how to polish it until it looked like armor. That sentence sat in me like a story you tell to keep from crying, and it steadied me through the first nights of mechanical thinking. Balance the bank account. Call the billing office for the hospital. Take on an extra shift at the plant. Find a day job with overtime. Never mention that you were humiliated in front of your child. I kept my voice small on the phone. I said the necessary things in the necessary way. There was an honesty to the small, everyday grind that felt like workmanlike worship, and I clung to it because the world had not yet learned to measure worth beyond what you could make for yourself. I started with the easy things. I trimmed the old lawn for the neighbor's pay. I fixed the screen door that had been gnawed by the dog. I walked Maya to school the next morning and made coffee strong enough that it seemed to burn the memory into neutral. The humiliation had broken something, but what it had not broken was my lifelong habit of returning to the ledger at night. I recorded every dollar I did not spend, every extra shift, every time I said no to the kind of comfort that would take more from me than it gave. I learned to read the world through small margins and finer arithmetic, and the Apple timer sat on my dresser like a tiny clockwork oracle. I glanced at it before sleep, wound it like a promise, and let its tiny clicks count out my patient plan. I would not throw rocks at Ethan in public or make a scene at another funeral. I would let the ledger do what it always does. Add up. I moved through the seasons with the slow, precise motion of someone doing math for survival, and the rumor mill of the family spun while I kept my head down. Ethan's name moved through it like a headline. A new truck, a partner in a bar that smelled of warm pretensions, a sudden string of friends who liked pictures with him holding 2 large glasses. He posted a photo of the house on social media with a caption about new beginnings and a string of emojis. A cousin commented with a heart, and someone I barely knew wrote a laughing emoji, the kind of sympathy that flirts with cruelty. I worked the night shift at a distribution center and the day shift doing landscaping jobs on the side. I learned how to open a small online store selling refurbished vintage lamps and practical things people want, but don't want to pay the new price for. I kept my eyes open to investments the way my father kept the radio tuned to the weather, practical, patient, an ear for when storms move in. I ate diner coffee again and sat with guys who smelled of motor oil and shared stories about missed chances and the shame of taking them. The gym felt like confession without the priest. I dated a woman, briefly, who had a laugh that landed like a bell and taught me that a man can be both soft and stubborn simultaneously. Maya's school concerts were no longer the place I missed out on. After a handful of contra dances and late-night sales, I could afford a flight and a ticket and the best seat in the hall. The small ledger I kept, receipts, copies of canceled checks, a list of chores done for the house, became in my head a map of labor, but I did not show it to anyone. I learned instead to let cash build around me quietly, like snow on a roof before an early thaw. When friends asked about my parents' will, I shrugged and said the safe, painless things. You can't control everything. My focus is different. They nodded and went back to swapping gossip. Patience is not waiting. Patience is the way you stand while the world spins itself into view. I told myself at nights when temptation and old anger crept like moths. That second quotable line was less theatrical than the first, and more dangerous because it taught me endurance. I started a small company with a partner from the factory, a practical man named Doug, who had a knack for seeing where other people wasted money. We remodeled abandoned storefronts into small distribution hubs for online sellers, and bought cheap properties with cash when people in our town panicked at every downturn. The economy was a tide, and we learned the patterns of it, not by flair, but by repetition and stubbornness. I kept my name off the bright marquee. Publicity was for men like Ethan who spent attention like credit. When Ethan blew through the inheritance on flashy renovations and a string of bad partnerships, the first signs were small. A late mortgage payment noticed in the neighborhood grapevine, a foreclosure notice pinned to the community board like a flag. I heard about it third hand at the diner where I was fixing a booth for a friend. Someone mentioned, as you mentioned recipes, that the house was in trouble. I felt a small, complicated thing. Not triumph, not vengeance yet, but the sense that the ledger was moving in my favor by force of arithmetic. I did not gloat. I made mental notes. I sent Maya to stay with her mother for a while because I did not want her to grow up watching me orchestrate a spectacle. Instead, I spent months learning the legal avenues, foreclosure hearings, bankruptcy filings. Not because I loved the law, but because a man who spent a decade of his life keeping his parents warm knows how to turn a system of rules into shelter. I called Jasper Collins once when he had been polite and competent at Harold's funeral, not to argue the will, but to ask how a man with nothing could recover from a bankruptcy if the charts were against him. Jasper answered with the kind of dry candor lawyers have. There are ways to be solvent that don't require headlines. He introduced me to a bank officer, Ava Mercer, who specialized in turnaround accounts and small community loans. I met her in a small office that smelled of lemon cleaner and seriousness. She looked at my ledger and did not laugh. I learned more about leverage and secured interests than I had ever wanted to know. These were not glamorous tools, but they were effective, the grind and ratchet of commerce that, like a good wrench, could undo a bad bolt. I set up a shell company with Doug and arranged for a series of small purchases. A minor debt here, a lien there, none of it illegal, all of it the kind of quiet, unflashy things that add up. Ethan continued to spend, to post, to flaunt. He invited people to a housewarming party after renovations, and the guest list included the same family members who had laughed at my funeral. He toasted with a glass that gleamed and a grin practiced in the mirror. He clinked his cup and someone filmed it for posterity. I was not there. I wound the apple-shaped timer at night and listened to it tick and tick, each turn a small mechanical prayer. The third time I heard my inner voice form something worth writing down for myself, it came like a clean cut. Justice is not a storm. It's a series of patient tides rearranging the sand until the truth shows its shape. That third quotable line lived in my plans. I set the pieces on the board and let the slow game begin. When the house's mortgage went unpaid and the bank posted a notice, Ethan called friends and blamed the economy like a man who had never had to explain himself to a ledger. He set a live stream to sell off heirlooms, furniture, an old war medal that belonged to Harold, the brass key to the basement where all the family tools lived, and people like vultures tuned in for cheap drama. The live auction was a crude pulsing thing, a theater of flashing screens and comment sections. I sat at a small table in a diner where the owner knew my name and the coffee was black and honest, watching the feed on a battered laptop. The Apple timer was on the table beside my cup like a small metronome. Ethan's face was flinty. He had the look of a gambler who believes luck will bail him out because he has never had to set the alarm. He picked up a battered clock that had been Harold's and joked how he would never wind it because he had no time for the past. The chat filled with laughing emojis, and some family members typed "sorry bro" in that peculiar way people use to wash their own guilt with a few cursory keystrokes. Jasper had advised me to watch quietly while the legal paperwork took its course. I had to avoid any action that could be slapped with a claim of bad faith. So I watched the auction as Ethan sold spoons and photographs and things whose worth to him was disposable, but to the rest of us were heavy with memory. The bidding slowed and then stopped. Buyers rarely come for the heavy things unless they can get them cheap. Ethan's phone vibrated and his face shifted from bravado to blankness in seconds. I did not call him. I made 2 discreet offers through the shell company Doug and I had set up, offers the bank couldn't refuse because they were clean and cash, for liens that were already in motion. The legal system, when used patiently, has its own architecture for restoring balance without melodrama. I arranged things so that when the sheriff's sale was scheduled, the bidders would include a curator from a local museum and a redevelopment group that could not purchase without clearance. But the entity that would show up with the necessary capital was mine. I bought the lien on the property quietly and paid the fees and the bank's costs and arranged for the title to transfer in a way that would not be a personal insult, but a public accounting. I planned the public moment with the same modesty that had characterized my life. A simple auction, a brief press release, a closing with cameras because the press likes the image of a fallen golden child humbled. The Apple timer, the thing that had ticked on my mother's table while she folded laundry and named the days, came with me to the closing like a relic. I put it on the conference table at the closing, wound it carefully with a thumb that had learned small precise movements over the years, and let it count down. I invited no one I did not have to invite. Maya came because she deserved to see the ledger close honestly. The day smelled of ozone and oil from the courthouse lawn where trucks idled. People from the original funeral showed up in a kind of awkward curiosity, faces flushed with the warmth of scandal. Ethan arrived last, panting like someone who believes running can fix bad decisions. Photographers snapped. Reporters asked about how things had turned out. I spoke only when necessary, because publicity is a cheap currency unless you want to burn it all in public. Jasper handled the language, and Ava handled the bank forms, and Doug balanced the accounts like the steady, indifferent hand of a man who knows what numbers mean. The Apple timer ticked in the middle of that sterile room, and its sound made everyone a little smaller. At a certain point, the last quotable line rose in my chest like a breath you don't know you were holding. Reputation is noise until your balance sheet shows who really paid for the quiet. I said nothing to the cameras. I let the papers make their headlines, the deed transferred. I took the keys. Ethan's face did something between a smile and a crack. He reached out as if to snatch any dignity left, and asked the sheriff, loud enough for microphones, if there was any recourse. There was, in the practical sense, always recourse. Bankruptcy, appeals, bargaining, but none for the performance he wanted. He had spent the inheritance, and then tried to auction the memory. I had purchased the ledger. The family murmured, and somewhere in that low conversation I heard the sound of my own breath steady into a new shape. I handed Ethan the Apple timer there on the conference table, its paint worn where my mother's thumb had kept time all those winters. He caught it like a prop, like a joke that had been passed around. I could have whispered a cutting thing. I could have stood on the table and recited the receipts. I did not. I walked out with the keys to the house in my pocket and the knowledge that the home would be restored, not as a personal monument, but as a place of real use for someone who needed shelter. The cameras followed us out into sunlight, and my phone hummed with messages I ignored. I left the press release to the lawyer and the final arrangement to the architect friend who would adapt the house for a small family clinic that would serve seniors and veterans for low cost. It was not theatrical revenge. It was a practical rearrangement of resources from a man who had burned what was entrusted to him into a cautionary ash. Ethan's face in the doorway, as the locks clicked shut behind me, looked smaller than it had when he first spoke at the funeral. He set the Apple timer down on the porch rail like a relic, and I heard him mutter something about time and luck. I drove away with Maya in the passenger seat and the town sliding by like the frames of a reel. The sun hit the truck's hood and made the world look cheap and honest at once. The house, the heirlooms, the photographs, they would be catalogued and preserved and put to use. In the back of my mind, the ledger closed with a neatness that felt like a hand smoothing a sheet. I had not set out to humiliate him in the rude way he had humiliated me. I had let the slow arithmetic do what it does. The final thing I told myself, plain and honest, because a life lesson worn thin by living deserves to be said simply. Do the work, and the balance will tell the truth. The rest, the small scars, the nights counting pennies into a jar, are what pay for a quiet exit. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.